Good Saturday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for May the 20th. Today, we're reading together in Deuteronomy chapter 14, which is going to contain, again, a number of rehashings of some things that have previously been spoken about. I would say that, again, as we're working through Deuteronomy, remember, it's good to remember that this text is written as the final words of Moses to the people, a number of speeches that he gives, which causes them to focus their minds on what is going to help them to be productive, what's going to help them to be successful and to be blessed within the promised land. So much of this that we find here, like for instance, what we have here within this chapter 14, where we have issues concerning pagan practices that they were not to participate in, their diet, things concerning their tithes and offerings to God. A lot of these subjects get entire chapters to themselves within parts of Exodus, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But here it's just a reminder. It's a reminder of Moses to the people that once you get into this land, these are going to be expectations for you. And if you will strive to meet these expectations, if you will honor God through your loyalty to his covenant, then you yourselves will be blessed in a tremendous way. So let's look at this today here in Deuteronomy chapter 14. Get the screen up, get the text up on the screen for us today. Again, we have three main subjects within this chapter. Verses 1 and 2, the forbidden pagan practices. Verses 3 through 21, the food practices, the dietary restrictions and commands for them. And then finally, in verses 22 through 29, I believe it is, we're going to have the tithing instructions. Let's read along here together in Deuteronomy chapter 14, beginning in verse number 1. Deuteronomy 14, verse number 1, you are the sons of Yahweh your God. Do not cut yourselves or make a bald spot on your head on behalf of the dead, for you are a holy people belonging to Yahweh your God. Yahweh has chosen you to be his own possession out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. You must not eat any detestable thing. These are the animals you may eat: oxen, sheep, goats, deer, gazelles, roe deer, wild goats, ibexes, antelopes, and mountain sheep. You may eat any animal that has hooves divided in two and chews the cud. But among the ones that chew the cud or have divided hooves, you are not to eat these: camels, hares, and hyraxes. Though they chew the cud, they do not have hooves. They are unclean for you. And the pigs, though they have hooves, they do not chew the cud. They are unclean for you. Do not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. You may eat everything from the water that has fins and scales, but you may not eat anything that does not have fins and scales. It is unclean for you. You may eat every clean bird, but these are the ones you are not to eat: eagles, bearded vultures, black vultures, the kites, and any kind of falcon, every kind of raven, ostriches, short-eared owls, gulls, any kind of hawk, little owls, long-eared owls, barn owls, eagle owls, ospreys, cormorants, storks, any kind of heron, hoopoes, and bats. All winged insects are unclean for you. They may not be eaten, but you may eat every clean flying creature. You are not to eat any carcass. You may give it to the resident alien within your city gates. He may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner. For you are a holy people belonging to Yahweh your God. Do not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Each year you are to set aside a tenth of all the produce grown in your fields. You are to eat a tenth of your new grain, or of your grain, new wine, and fresh oil, and the firstborn of your flock, or of your herd and flock, in the presence of Yahweh your God at the place where he chooses to have his name dwell, so that you will always learn to fear Yahweh your God. But if the distance is too great for you to carry it, since the place where Yahweh your God chooses to put his name is too far away from you, and since Yahweh your God has blessed you, then exchange it for silver, and take the silver in your hand, and go to the place where Yahweh your God chooses. You may spend the silver on anything you want: cattle, sheep, goats, wine, beer, or anything you desire. You are to feast there in the presence of Yahweh your God, and rejoice with your family. Do not neglect the Levite within your city gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you. At the end of every 3 years, bring a tenth of all your produce for that year, and store it within your city gates. Then the Levites then the Levite who has no portion or inheritance among you, the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow within your city gates may come, eat, and be satisfied. And Yahweh your God will bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. And that is Deuteronomy chapter 14. Again, three subjects, three main sections here in chapter 14: the forbidden practices 1 and 2, 3 through 21, the dietary instructions, and then 22 through the end of the chapter, verse 29, we have the instructions concerning the tithe. Again, all these are just reminders to the people concerning what was expected of them within the land, things we've already seen in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, most of which have greater detail within those particular texts. So here, thinking about these forbidden pagan practices, we begin by recognizing that you are sons of Yahweh your God. You are his people that he created, that he gave birth to through the Exodus. You are a special people. It's emphasized here on, there's actually an inclusio here that begins in chapter 1 or verse 2 and goes through 21 that talks about them being a holy people belonging to Yahweh your God. The exact same sentence is said in verse 2 and verse 21. So then we can frame everything that is mentioned in between these two bookends as having to do with the holiness of the people, in the fact that they are the people of a holy God. So to think about these practices, making cuts on yourselves, making bald spots on your head, those are all pagan practices, things that they did in order to practice divination or some sort of speaking with the dead. God says that's not what you do. You separate yourselves from the pagans by not participating in these pagan practices. That's not how you behave, because you're holy. You are special. You are unique. You are different. You are like your God. And that carries in even into the dietary restrictions that we see in verses 3 through 21. We could go back to Leviticus 11, 1 through 23, and also chapter 20 and verses 22 through 26 to find these instructions given in greater detail. But what this does at the end of the day is it makes Israel unique and set apart. Really, I hadn't thought about it in this way until just the study for this particular reading. It's really Jew versus Gentile. That Jews, the people of God, the people of Israel, would be set apart from the Gentiles, the rest of the nations, by these dietary restrictions. And that was important, again, just to emphasize to the people that you are different and that you are special. Going back to verse number 2, Yahweh has chosen you to be his own possession out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, you are his special people, and that is all encompassing, even in the way that you eat. So what we have here, the way I believe I mentioned this back in our read through this in Leviticus a couple months ago, what we have here is really standard versus non-standard animals, typical versus non-typical animals. You might say that the standard and typical way of animals is for land animals that they have divided hoof and then they chew cud. That would be your typical standard animal. That is a clean animal. You can eat that animal. Well, those that are not like that, those that do not meet these two stipulations, they either don't chew cud or they don't have a divided hoof. Those are non-standard, non-typical. Those are unclean. Those are not for you. All those various things that are mentioned in verses 7 and 8. They're to not eat their meat or even touch their carcasses, which think about the story of the prodigal son. Believe it that would be set as a Jewish family who he leaves his father's house, takes his inheritance, goes, squanders it, finds himself destitute. He's working amongst the pigs, feeding the pigs. This unclean animal, feeding the pigs, even eating what was left over from the pigs. What a disgraceful scene that would be for a young Jewish man. And we see that here, do not eat their meat. Do not touch their carcasses. Same things with fish in the water. Typical fish, standard fish would be those with scales and fins. Non-typical fish would be those that don't have scales or that don't have fins. So I'm thinking like eels don't have fins for the most part. Catfish don't have scales, so they would not have been having any catfish frying parties going on in Israel. Same thing for birds. There are clean birds and there are non-clean birds. Most people think that this is probably separated between what type of food these birds eat, that those who eat other animals, carcasses, especially dead animals, those would be things that you are not allowed to eat, or they're just very strange birds. Think about ostriches. Ostriches are definitely not your typical bird, therefore they would be non-standard. And then some of the translation here in verses 11 through 18, they're very unique words that are only found here in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. So with that being the case, it's kind of difficult to translate them if there's not a lot of extra biblical material by which to translate them. So that's probably the difference that accounts then for the differences in the various translations you get from Bible to Bible. Verses 19 and 20 talks about the flying insects and flying creatures, those that are good, those that are bad. But verse 21, do not eat any carcass. Anything that has died naturally, you don't eat that. Why? Well, because death is the exact opposite of God. If God is life, then death is certainly not something that God abides with. Death is not holy. So therefore, do not participate in that. Now, you might give it to the resident alien laying around you or the foreigner, because again, there's a difference between the Jews and the Gentiles. You Jews don't eat these things, yet you may supply them to Gentiles so that they can partake. Again, the inclusio at the end of verse 21, for you are a holy people belonging to Yahweh your God. And then there's that super strange that we've already talked about briefly before, very strange sentence, do not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. And yet I recently heard that this is kind of the foundation for modern kosher laws, that this is the reason why they keep their meat and dairy separately. So that's just a little interesting tidbit for you. Verse 22 kicks off the section concerning the tithe. A tithe is a tenth. That's something that's probably a good thing to mention. You cannot tithe 15% or 20%, 25%. That's not a tithe. A tithe is 10%. And here for the people, each year they were to tithe. They were to give 10% of what they had in an offering to Yahweh. The grain, the new wine, the fresh oil, the firstborn of the herd and the flock. They are to go and to offer this in the presence of Yahweh. Now, we might see this as a burden, but it would have been good, especially going back to the past couple of chapters. There's been a lot of talk concerning rejoicing in the life that they get to live as the people of God. There should be rejoicing even in this, because this is a celebration of God's blessings, that God has blessed them so much that they are able to take a tenth of it and give it back to Him, and they'll be okay. In fact, you might even be blessed so much that you're incapable of taking a tenth to the place where Yahweh has placed His name. That's mentioned beginning in verse number 24. That if the distance is too great for you to carry it, if you've been overly abundantly blessed that you can't take everything that is a tenth to the name where, or to the place where to the place where Yahweh's name is. Again, we're talking about Gilgal, Shechem, Shiloh, eventually Jerusalem. If you can't get there, then just convert the value to silver, take it there, and you can purchase what you would have given here. You can purchase that there. Now, we know from the gospel accounts that this unfortunately ended up being corrupted, and people took advantage of these situations and just ridiculously charged people in the money exchanges and stuff like that. Jesus did not appreciate that whatsoever. So that's something that to connect with the gospel accounts. But also the end of verse 23, that you will always learn to fear Yahweh your God. Do this recognizing that God doesn't need these things. He doesn't need these things, but He deserves these things. Therefore, this fear, again, it's not just respect, but it's also not abject terror. It is a recognition of Yahweh's character, of who He is and what He deserves. And in doing this, you are able to celebrate what God has given you by giving to Him, again, what He deserves. Let's see here. Once we get down to verse 27, we see another emphasis of the tithing is that this would, whenever they go there, you are to feast. Actually, beginning in middle of verse 26, you are to feast there in the presence of Yahweh your God and rejoice with your family. There's that word. I knew it was in here somewhere. Rejoice with your family. So this, again, is not to be seen as a burden. This is a time of rejoicing. Rejoice that Yahweh has blessed us so much, but also do not neglect the Levite within your city gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you. And then there's some additional words concerning that at the end of every 3 years, bring a tenth of all your produce for that year and store it within your city gates to give to those who don't have, to the Levite, to the resident alien, to the fatherless, to the widow. Share with one another. There was a great note in one of my resources that identifies, I believe, to be a very true statement, probably something that we would do well to consider today. Nonetheless, the Torah does not envision a welfare system administered by political bureaucracy and based on a centralized system of taxation. The well-being of the potentially marginalized depends on the charity of all of its citizens. I like that a lot. That's me personally. I like that a lot. Let me perform charity. Let me help those who are in need, because I know whenever I do that, I know where my money's going, and I'm able to really focus and do good with money. I respect the government. I appreciate that God has put it in place to help us a great deal in the way we live life. But man, I wish they wouldn't waste like they do, because then maybe people wouldn't be so prickly about taxation and stuff like that if they actually knew where their money was going. Nonetheless, I'm getting off my soapbox. Don't want to get into that today. Here, the emphasis is, though, on you do good. Don't shovel off your responsibility on the government or on someone else. You do good. You take care of those who are among you. Because remember, he could tie this into something that has been previously said on a number of occasions. Take care of the resident alien because you once were that. Take care of the fatherless or the widow because you could be in that situation one day. Therefore, now when you have, help them to have as well. The grace that has been shown to you by Yahweh, you show that grace in the same way. And certainly that's a lesson for us. Again, the grace that we have been shown by Yahweh in so many ways in our lives, we should be a people that turn around and show that grace to others. As we are blessed, we should be a people who bless others. I appreciate so much you tuning into this reading on this Saturday morning. Hope you have a great rest of your Saturday, and we'll be back at it again tomorrow, reading together in Deuteronomy chapter 15, which is going to talk about three different, or let's see, we've got 4 different chapter headings: debts canceled, lending to the poor, release of slaves, and consecration of the firstborn animals. We'll be talking about those things tomorrow. Again, these subjects get a lot more play in previous writings, so this is just the reminder of Moses concerning these things, and we'll read about that tomorrow. Looking forward to it. Again, have a great rest of your Saturday, everyone. Take care, and God bless.